The People's National Congress Reform, PNCR, presents Nation Watch.
As Guyana sits on the economic and political crossroads, we speak to the nation's opinion leaders and decision makers to get their views on the challenges the country faces and the path it must take to achieve national development. Welcome to Nation Watch. Now here is your host Mervyn Williams, former member of the Guyana Parliament.
Hello everyone and welcome to Nation Watch for today, 6th August 2023. Today marks 38 years since the death of our founder leader, Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham, and we're going to be discussing Burnham emancipation and independence. Before we do, let's bring you up to scratch with a few things that are happening or have happened in Guyana's hinterland. On the 7th of July, the Ministry of Education decided it was no longer going to send an aircraft to take our indigenous YY children home from the dormitory facilities of the secondary school of Aishalton to their home in Massacanary. This is the third time that they have done this to our YY children. It's unfortunate, it is inconsiderate, it's unacceptable. So our children had to travel home over a period of 4 days along the trail, along the river. Part of the journey entailed walking for 20 kilometers. 20 kilometers. Our children were forced to walk because the government of Guyana decided it was not going to provide an aircraft which would get them home within an hour. It took them 4 days to get home. Over a Chinese landing in Region 1, the government is nervously assembling a team to sending there so that they can pretend to be doing something in response to the UN Human Rights Commission's report and recommendation regarding mining operations in the indigenous Carib village of Chinese landing. Advocates from this party, the People's National Congress Reform, and the parliamentary opposition have been at work on this matter. This has been discussed extensively here on Nation Watch and other media. And the Amerindian People's Association has been working very closely with the leadership of Chinese landing to bring attention to this matter. And we salute the APA for taking the petition to the UN Human Rights Commission and for seeing it through to where it's at today. We hope that some relief will come to the people of Chinese landing. It took all of those efforts and all those levels of advocacy for the government to react. Over in Aishalton, the radio tower has been knocked down by a truck. We will remember that Radio Aishalton was a gift to the people of the South Rupununi by the Granger administration. It was a project supervised, managed by Prime Minister Moses Nagamutu, as he then was. So Radio Aishalton is out of operation. Welcome Mr. Vincent Alexander AA, who is chairman of the Forbes Burnham Foundation, also chairman of IPADG, I believe.
That's correct.
Yep. And who is a leading light in a number of areas, but today we're going to ask for his expert knowledge on the man, Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham. Your opening remarks, please, Mr. Alexander.
Well, today we mark the 30th death anniversary of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham. I do not normally associate the word memorial with activities related to Burnham. I prefer to use the word commemorative. I think given the life that he lived and the legacy that he's left, we ought to be commemorating. And the extent to which the things that he did are still impacting our lives is the extent to which one may argue that Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham is still present in the lives of the Guyanese people And therefore, what one has to do whenever important moment in his life comes around is to celebrate and to commemorate rather than to memorialize. He has not died. His body has left the earthly plane, but the man, his works, his impact are still very, very much relevant and still very, very much with us. And we ought to commemorate and celebrate that fact.
Burnham, that name that troubles some, that name that inspires others. He was a man, he was a man who meant different things and mean different things to different people. But the truth is the truth. It cannot be altered. Burnham was Guyana's first, Georgetown's first mayor. In internal self-government before independence, he was Guyana's first education minister. As premier in 66, he led Guyana to independence and became our first prime minister of independent Guyana. By 1970, he had led Guyana to Republican status. 1 year later, he had presented to the Guyanese nation a new constitution in 1980. He also then became Guyana's first executive president. Burnham's government built roads, including Linden Highway, the road to the East Coast, the Essequibo Coast, the West Demerara, West Bank and West Coast Demerara. He built bridges, including the Demerara Harbor Bridge. He built the telecommunications network. He built the electricity distribution network at Anvawak and at Garden of Eden, which still exists, which still powers our nation's electricity grids. He built the Social Security scheme, the National Insurance Scheme. People still rely on and benefit from that. Burnham nationalized bauxite, sugar, and other industries, presented a nation with free education from nursery to university, free health care at all levels, built dozens of schools, dozens of health centers, clinics, and hospitals, built the university. What inspired Burnham to lead a nation's development in the structured format that he did? Did this flow from a passion for development that he woke up one morning and envisioned, or was it an inspiration that flowed from that period before Africans became free and Guyana became independent?
When you talk about Burnham, you have to look at it from a number of perspectives. I think, firstly, one has to accept that he was talented and that people are born with talents. And Burnham was undoubtedly one of those persons who was born with exceptional talents at the level of his intellect and his capacity to understand, to absorb, and to analyze. And therefore, he had tools which, if he deployed, and in fact, which when he deployed, made him the person that he became. But one also has to look to Burnham from the standpoint of his own life experience. Burnham did not come from a family that was able to afford all that a young person needed. Burnham was able to understand deprivation in his own growing up. For example, lots of people don't know, in the era of Burnham, one could have paid to go to Queen's College. In fact, Chelly's Jagan's father brought him to Georgetown and paid him to go to Queen's College. Burnham had to, in the first instance, attend Central High because his parents could not afford to pay him to go to Queen's College. And using his natural talents and abilities, he won 2 scholarships consecutively to attend and remain in Queen's College. So Burnham had an appreciation of what life was like for the quote-unquote ordinary man. It is said that sometimes Burnham even walked in the village of Kitty selling milk to assist his family in terms of the economic means. So that with the intellect that he had and with the exposure to life that he had, there came a commitment to make a difference, not to have the nation and its children and the nation at large have the same experience that he had. And fortunately for us, he had the kind of intellect that he could deploy to make a difference. He could study history, understand the lessons of history. And in that regard, yes, we may look back to the history of Guyana and his own understanding of enslavement, his own understanding of the emancipation, the post-emancipation period up to independence, his ability to analyze from the standpoint of the interest of the people, and therefore, on that basis, to come forward with ideas and policies and programs to make sure that as individuals, we were not subjected to what he had been subjected to. And as a nation, that we went beyond the country in which he grew up, which was a dependent country, which was a colony. So both in terms of the Guyanese person and in terms of Guyana, Burnham's experiences helped to shape his thoughts about this nation, given the fact that he had the kind of talent that he could deploy to bring to bear on what was necessary to help in individual emancipation of the individual Guyanese and to help in the emancipation of Guyana at large.
It might be a little bit controversial here for the historians, but it appeared to me that, from my reading, that emancipation in this part of the world was not based on the desire by the plantocracy or the colonial masters to free Africans. It was really the product of a challenge, economic challenge. Beet and other sweeteners were challenging cane sugar. And there had to be a way for the plantocracy to emerge financially better off, so that the shackles may have been removed from the wrists and ankles of the Africans, but they still had to work another 4 years for free while they were taught how to live as free men and women. In the meantime, the plantocracy earned money for losses that they valued their freed assets now, and they were also paid to teach them how to live freely. Burnham spoke about the need for, having attained independence from the colony, from the colonial masters, the need for Guyana to move towards what he called economic independence. There seemed to be a parallel there for the free Africans and a free nation. Speak to that, please.
Well, first of all, the question of beet and what was happening in Europe, I think that really occurred in the latter days. But I would argue that the movement towards quote-unquote emancipation had a lot to do indeed with the sugar industry becoming uneconomical. And that in the main was related to the problems that the plantocracy was faced with from the standpoint of the ongoing, continuous struggle of the enslaved to emancipate themselves. That is what really made sugar at that time in the 19th century uneconomical. And so they were, in fact, looking for a way out, combined with the fact that there were other forces, global forces, that also saw slavery as unacceptable and were contributing to the anti-slavery struggle. So that is what really, in my view, contributed. You know, there's a lot that's unsaid about the struggles of the enslaved people. You know, their attempts to escape physically from enslavement, establishing maroon villages in various parts of Guyana. We don't speak much about maroons in Guyana, but in fact, there was even an occasion when there was a maroon uprising in West Navarro. You know, the fact that the way in which they sought on the estate the plantations, not the estates at that time, to withdraw labor in various ways, and the kind of internal struggles on those plantations. That's what really led largely to the decision of the British to bring slavery to an end. But one can again look back to 1763 and the struggles thereafter, and the fact that in 1763, what Coffee did was in virtue to declare a republic.
Yes,
Well,
Republic of
declare
Berbice.
a republic.
Yeah.
You know, not to declare independence, to declare a republic. And we need to understand the difference between a country which is merely independent and a country which embraces republican status. When we talk about republican status, we're really talking about a country where sovereignty is vested in the people. You can have an independent country, well, they're no longer colonies, so to speak, but they don't necessarily get to the point where sovereignty is vested in the people. And that was our experience when we got independence. We were still a British subject insofar as the Queen was still at the head of state. And we know that in the British Empire, for all intents and purposes, sovereignty is vested in the Queen, not in the people. It's a part of the whole feudal system. So that when we talk about 1763 as a lesson, we are talking at the same time about 1970.
Yeah.
Because it's only in 1970 that we moved to become a republic with a clear understanding that the struggle had its origin in 1763. We were drawing lessons from what happened in 1763. We were drawing lessons from the aspirations of the people of 1763 as we move towards republican status in 1970. And so the question that arises there when we talk about republican status is not just a question of political independence. It's not just a question of being in government. It's a question of exercising sovereignty. And the exercise of sovereignty means that you take ultimate control over the destiny of your country. You take ultimate control over the affairs of your country. And ultimate control would mean that you take control over economic life, over social life, over cultural life. So one needs to understand what the republican status really meant. And therefore to understand that when we talked about emancipation, we at that time, in terms of what occurred, did not attain as a nation that collective responsibility for our being and for our country. Emancipation simply meant that people of African descent were in some regards being released, had attained their freedom from enslavement, but into a colonial system that was still highly exploitative, a colonial system which saw the plantocracy continuing to bleed the country in the interests of their motherland. And so emancipation has to be seen in that context, in the context of a change in the way in which the economy was being organized, because the prior manner was no longer effective. Slavery could no longer work. But it didn't mean that the British intended to make us a free people in the sense that we were going to enjoy the right to make decisions for ourselves, to be sovereign. No, not at all. We continued to be subjects.
Fast
The
forward,
Queen.
fast forward to today. We have an administration in independent Republic Guyana, which, in my humble estimation, fits the descriptive that you just gave. Controlling, exploitative. Are we back to the days of plantocracy?
Certainly, we have a situation where we do not have a system that allows the average Guyanese to be the beneficiary of the patrimony of the country, the wealth of the nation. We have a system where, on one hand, a particular class is dominated and has replaced the former colonial exploiters. We now have an internal situation in some regards where the quote unquote, one has to be careful with that, where the business class is the dominant and exploitative class. If one listens to President Ali in all that he says, it's all about one, material wealth, and two, about the private sector being the producers of that material wealth, and in fact being the beneficiaries of that material wealth. So we do have that situation internally. But when one talks about independence in the context of a republic, one has also to look at relations with other countries, whether one is able to engage other countries on an equal footing, or whether we have a situation where you have what you call the center and the periphery. And for all intents and purposes, we have a two-tier exploitative system. We are still on the periphery of economic relations with center countries. And internally, you have a class situation where there's an alliance between the business class and the external exploitative forces that are imposing their will and exploiting the ordinary people. And so in that regard, I think that an understanding and a study of Burnham becomes very, very critical, because in fact what he sought to do was to remove us from both the external situation in terms of being exploited in a center periphery situation where we merely produced raw materials that were subject to fluctuating market prices and had to be importing value-added goods that were largely on the up in terms of price, never on the down. And therefore, one could find that over time, we got relatively poorer in relation to those countries. And here one could talk about the way in which Walter Rodney talked about the underdevelopment of Africa. And we can extrapolate and see the similar situation here in Guyana. So one had to compete with that situation. And then the internal situation, how even if you start to have an economy that is relatively independent, not dependent on external forces, how do you bring about equalization between the working people and those who may be the owners the means of production. And that was what Burnham saw as the challenge: internal relationships and the external relationships. And one must recognize he was not single in that regard, that this was a movement across the so-called third world. We saw the Nkrumahs, we saw the Nyerire's, we may even reference the Castros, all of whom came together, both in terms of the collectively trying to have the so-called third world or the South combat with the North on one hand, but also seeking to transform and restructure the internal systems in the interests of the working people. And we are still faced with that challenge today because we have subjected ourselves to what is referred to as a neoliberal situation, where it is argued that the market forces are the determining factors in what happens in terms of economic growth and economic development and the deployment of the returns from economic activity. So we still have that internally, as much as we still have that externally, where it's not simply a relationship any longer between colonizing country and the colonized country, but it's a relationship between transnationals, which have become even more powerful than individual countries, and the neo-colonial states. So for all intents and purposes, we still have the same structural relationships existing, the same exploitation of the ordinary man, and the challenges as to how we deal with that, challenges which have not been dealt with by the current regime because they have submitted themselves to the neoliberal model. You know, I would normally refer to the People's Progressive Party and their government as being bipolar. Bipolar. And what do I mean by that? On one hand, they have embraced economic policies which are neoliberal, which are not in the interests of the locals, not in the interests of the working people. And so you see an economic model that's associated in some regards with capitalism. So you can say in some regards, they're capitalists. But in most capitalist countries, the capitalism is accompanied, complemented by a democratic system, for what it's worth. But here in Guyana, that is not the case. Here in Guyana, we have a party which embraces neoliberalism, but at the same time fashions itself off of what pertained in communist countries in terms of the political system and the political control in particular. So in that regard, as I said, they could be seen as a bipolar political party, trying to, on one hand, demonstrate that they are capitalists, but that's only in the economic sphere. But in the political sphere, it's very much a dictatorship that has emerged, and by virtue of that, has enabled the economic system that is exploitative of the ordinary people.
I want to cling to a few things you said, Mr. Alexander. You spoke about the business class. You spoke about the private sector. You put context to what you said. The business class at one time included African Guyanese entrepreneurs. African Guyanese owned corporate entities, whether they be rice mills, manufacturing entities, the construction sector, Twiga, Barima, and all these different entities that we know existed. Where have they gone? Why did they leave us? Why is it on to this day we still see photographs of contract signing, contract award, contract in motion? And the only time you see African Guyanese is when you see a picture of someone doing menial labor. You do not see photographs of African Guyanese signing contracts, except maybe they be contracts for $2 million, of which they'll earn 100 or $200,000. But mega contracts, 300 million United States dollars contracts, 2 billion Guyana dollar contracts. You do not see African Guyanese businessmen and women in those circles, in those pictures, benefiting from those contracts. What is wrong?
First of all, let me say that yes, we did have a period in this country where one could point to certain African Guyanese businessmen. But I think we have to accept the fact of the matter is that African Guyanese never were quantitatively a dominant part of the business sector, never were. And that has to do with the way in which Guyana evolved, the manner in which African Guyanese, having relieved themselves of the burden of slavery, moved towards the villages to establish an agricultural economy, which could have led to them being dominant in terms of business. But that agricultural economy was suppressed by the plantation owners by virtue of flooding and things like that. And so African Guyanese were left with no option but to migrate to the urban areas or to commute to the urban areas to take up essentially jobs in the public sector. So that is how structurally, in terms of the economy and employment, things emerged for the African Guyanese. But going on further, we see that when Guyana was faced with economic problems, and we had to confront those problems under the influence of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, that the programs that they put in place, particularly the program that led to the devaluation, was devastating for the African Guyanese businesses which were around. Devastating. They simply went under. The exchange rate was murderous, so to speak. And let me give a simple example that is not necessarily business related. I remember as a young man beginning to work, I purchased an insurance policy. And that policy was a 20-year policy valued at $20,000. Now, at that time, $20,000 could have bought 2 mini miners in Guyana, 2 cars, $20,000. Unfortunately, my policy went over into the period of the economic crisis, the devaluation. And when I got my $20,000, my policy matured, I probably couldn't even buy a bicycle. So you see what I'm saying that to say where the African businessmen found themselves, particularly those who had access loans from the commercial banks to invest in their businesses. They literally went under. And what may be argued is that, notwithstanding the fact that the PNC was in government, it is the African businesses and the public sector, largely populated by Africans, who face the brunt of what we called economic recovery. And so that's an interesting question, because here again you see a country that is multi-ethnic, that in some regards, in the early days, the enslaved people bear the brunt of the country's development by virtue of their unpaid labor. And now that we were in a modern era, we're again facing the brunt of the country's development by virtue of where they were located in the economy and the economic policies that were in place to, so to speak, get us out of the economic crisis which we were in. So that without prejudice to the presence of and the role of other Guyanese, I think that the people of African descent have suffered coming out of enslavement. They suffered enslavement. They suffered coming out of enslavement. There may have been a period when there were efforts to equalize them, but they again suffered significantly during the period of economic recovery, so to speak, and are not the ones who have been given any kind of equitable consideration in this present period in an attempt to equalize them. And it's in that regard that Burnham becomes a very, very important reference point, because Burnham, in my humble opinion, understood the dilemma of Guyanese. He understood the specific dilemma of African Guyanese, and in response to that understanding, sought to do a number of things that were not detrimental to other Guyanese, but were beneficial to the people of African descent. And so when Burnham talked about the cooperative, he was really talking about the way in which ordinary people who could not muster large sums to go into business could collectively put their money together and still get into business. And so that was going to affect all working people, but more particularly the people of African descent who had been placed in a particular situation based on enslavement and what happened post emancipation. And there were other things he did, not only in the area of cooperatives in terms of business, but cooperatives in terms of housing, where once again the people of African descent, like others, but more needy than others, could access housing through his policies of cooperative housing, where the cooperative bore the brunt in terms of the acquisition of the land, where the cooperatives had to face the bank and not the individuals, and where the individuals were able to have assistance in terms of tax reliefs for building material, time off from their jobs to build their homes. Burnham was really in those policies, addressing issues that have remained largely unaddressed. And incidentally, I would argue that if one looks to the International Decade for the People of African Descent and the recognition of the world of the state of people of African descent and the need for the state to provide redress for the state of the people of African descent, one could see that some of what Burnham was doing, although he did not articulate it as if it were to help the people of African descent, and in fact it was wider than that, but what he was doing is the kind of policy required even today, if we are to provide an opportunity for the people of African descent to overcome the disadvantageous position that they've been placed in by the way in which this country has evolved in terms of its economics and consequentially in terms of its politics.
Burnham's tenure was during that time when the world was in a difficult place. Oil crisis, the Cold War, all these different elements. Yet Burnham never bowed to the East or the West. That brought him some challenges. Coupled with the internal challenges, some of which you've already identified and dealt with in great detail. How did he manage to keep Guyana focused? how did he manage to craft the kind of foreign policy that resulted in Guyana's sovereignty and territorial integrity remaining intact and Guyana's economy floating?
I think what's important in what Burnham did, important and critical, was the belief in his leadership on one hand, and the people's consciousness on the other hand. Burnham could only have survived, Guyana could only have survived and prospered with the people's commitment, people's understanding of where we came from and what is it we were trying to do. You know, there are a lot of formal reports about the economic state of Guyana, but I always contend that even in the face of those formal reports and issues of the state of the economy, that Guyanese largely were able to overcome that period because there was a great degree of food security. Food security, I mean, people will tell you Burnham banned this and Burnham banned that.
We had Tanya Dal.
But there was food security. Burnham encouraged the Guyanese people at the individual level, at the community level, at the commercial level to be involved in agriculture.
Yeah.
And so whilst we don't have stats on how many sticks of cassava an individual Guyanese planted, and therefore could reap and eat in the face of low wages, I think that has a lot to do with the survival of Guyana and Guyanese in the face of the economic downturn, which occurred really early, almost the mid 70s, with the oil crisis. But one also has to attribute our success to the fact that Burnham imbued in us a feeling of nationhood, a feeling of citizenship that allowed us to confront psychologically and mentally the pressures which we were under. It was as if to say, yes, you're pressuring us, but we ain't backing down. And so we ain't backing down was not only about the border and the defending our territorial and, sovereignty. It was not backing down from being a people, an independent people, in the sense that we were now thinking independently and seeking to move that thought process into our economic, social, and cultural life. Leadership was critical. People's belief in what was happening was essential. And there is where we have a significant difference today. We don't have the same level of leadership. Our leadership today does not speak about values, does not speak about nationhood. All it speaks about is material wealth, to the detriment of the working people who are in a situation where they are either exploited or outside of the loop of economic activity.
Now, Burnham championed the cause of the Southern African Liberation Movement. Burnham was a founding father of CARIFTA, the Caribbean Free Trade Area, founding father of the West Indian Federation, and what we know today as CARICOM. He led from the front in the area of food security. He spoke at length about the Caribbean region and food security. He was given the lead role in that regard and set up in Guyana a structure that started in the family, moved to the schools, entered the community, and resulted in the kind of food security to which you alluded. Special schools were established for that purpose. I believe one recently was flattened by fire. All of these things have happened. Burnham and his foreign policy saw Guyana being represented at the level of the Security Council of the UN, saw Guyana being regarded highly at all international fora, saw Guyana building bridges and creating friendships that allowed this country the kind of support whenever it was necessary on the international front. We have moved from those days. In fact, Burnham was voted the Caribbean Man of the Century for his efforts both nationally and internationally. We have moved from those days now to a point where it appears that Guyana does not fashion her own foreign policy. How would you regard such a suggestion?
Let me say two things. One has to remember that Burnham studied in England. And studying in England exposed Burnham to people of like mind, to people who were themselves going through that developmental process, personal developmental process. And I'm talking here about the Manleys, the Barrows, the Nereris, the Nkrumahs. And so we see emerging out of the bosom of the metropole leaders who went back, understanding, of course, they were the talented ones, the ones who could do the things I talked about earlier, do the analysis, understand the history, and they were able to go back to give leadership to their countries. And out of their own collaboration and cooperation in London, for example, Burnham was in the West Indian Student Union.
Yeah.
So that already there he knew, understood how to work with others. So came back as a leader already having an exposure to and a desire to work with others. And that to a large extent influenced the way in which he dealt with foreign policy. He dealt with foreign policy from the standpoint that he took positions which were not incongruent, which were congruent, in other words, with other third world leaders. So you can look to his relationship with Kaunda of Zambia, Nyerere, the attention he paid to Africa and India, all of which were colonies and coming out of colonization and seeking betterment for their people. So he saw the possibility not only of what he could do internally, but the way in which he could collaborate collectively among the countries that were the affected countries. You know, we have to bear in mind that there's always been this collaboration. For example, when we talk about the third world, when we talk about Africa, we saw how the Europeans came together, I think it was in 1848, if I'm not mistaken. They came together and held a conference to discuss how they will divide up Africa. And that's how they drew the lines and the boundaries that we now see in Africa. They were collaborating in the process of exploiting and fashioning an economy to exploit the developing countries. And so equally, people like Burnham could understand the power of collaboration. And that is what would have led to his bilateral relations with countries, his multilateral relations with countries, and the fostering of CARICOM, involvement in the non-aligned movement. He understood the history of world development. You could be on one side of the coin, be on the exploiter side, you could be on the other side of the coin. We were on the other side of the coin, but he understood what were the kind of strategies that were necessary to facilitate the kind of growth and development at the national level in the context of collaboration with countries that were in a similar and like state.
We have about 6 minutes remaining on Nation Watch today. Now, the African village movement, the thrift society, the cooperativism, the cooperative societies being birthed out of that, the cooperative republic obviously having something to do with that kind of foundation. The similarities between the African village movement and the indigenous Guyanese village movement may be not very well known or appreciated, but it's there. It's very, very similar. It resulted in Burnham fashioning a system of governance in Guyana where the village determined what was going to happen above the village level. So there was a bottom-up approach to management of the country Guyana. What we have now is a situation where that has been completely overturned. And we have gone back to what appears to be that heavy-handed colonial type approach with a Russian flavor, I dare say, in terms of how Guyana is being managed. Compare that in the next 5 minutes or so, if you can, with Burnham's approach to governance, which you've outlined.
He made a very important point. When Burnham sought to introduce cooperativism, Burnham did not merely address the question of the African Guyanese. Burnham contended that the manner of existence, of life of the indigenous people was also cooperative, communal. Burnham pointed to the fact that even the Indo-Guyanese, those who moved off of the plantation, themselves acquired villages and were involved in what may be called the village movement. I think this really started in the East Berbice area, somewhere in the Palmyra area. So he said, look, when I talk about cooperativism, I am not merely addressing what seems to be a tradition of the people of African descent, but it has become a tradition of the Guyanese by virtue of what happens in the Amerindian community, what happens in the African community, and what was happening in the Indo-Guyanese community. Of course, the Portuguese, one may have seen a different kind of emergence, bearing in mind that they were given privileges in commerce when they came to Guyana. And so they were given an opportunity to develop in a different way. But I'll argue that notwithstanding, that they too were among themselves cooperatives,
Yes.
and probably quietly still are to the cooperative. So that's important for us to understand that Burnham, though he seemed to have understood the dilemma of the various ethnic groups and sought to address them, though he may not have been very covert in his articulation of addressing the dilemma of the various groups. But that's exactly what he was doing. Now, that allowed for a bottom-up approach to development. We used to say things like, all politics are local, that local government is the training ground for national politicians. This is how we said it. We didn't have a parachuter country where people parachuted onto the top of the political system, not having come through the ranks of the political system from the bottom up. We now have a parachuter system. We now have a command system where decisions are made at the top and passed down, where it is merely the dreams and imaginations of an individual. You know, I don't have a problem with a president who has ideas and so. But if you have a system where every minister tells you everything that's happening is at the behest of the president, something is wrong with the rest of us. That everything that's happening is at the behest of the president. So we have a brainless nation. We don't have a nation that includes people in the decision making and the determination of things. Everything, you listen to every statement every minister makes, is very disrespectful of themselves. It's all because of the president. It's not even the party sometimes, it's the president. So we have that command system, which is understandable because the PPP, as I said, they're bipolar, and they have continued at the Congresses to contend that they have not departed from the Marxist understanding of things. I may be critical of the practice of Marxism, but certainly the practice speaks to a command system where decisions are made at the top and passed down for implementation at the bottom. And in the context of the economics, where the people at the top are preferred, then the decisions made are in the interest of the preferred people, but passed down to the people at the bottom to say, this is how things will be done. Now, one would accept that if you're talking by medicine, that if you're bipolar, is to be sick. And so if we have a bipolar party and a bipolar approach to the management of our country,
And by presidency.
and probably by presidency, then we are a dysfunctional and sick country that needs to go through a significant transformation in the manner of the conduct of the country's business if you're to get it right. You can't have a president who is spouting democracy and still going to villages and saying, I will not speak to your elected leaders, I'm speaking to the community. The community, we know from the days of Athens, it was determined that the people could not, in their large numbers, be the decision-making forum, and therefore you have a system evolving of representation. That's why we have local government. It's a part of the representative system that history has brought into vogue. And here we have a government, a president and a vice president, who blatantly tell this nation they're not talking to the people's representatives, that they're talking to the people. And so they are taking us back to the dysfunctionality of early democracy, which was recognized and led to the evolution of modern democracy, where you have inclusion and representation. We are a sick, bipolar, dysfunctional nation that needs to be turned upside down.
And may I add, perhaps we need Burnham all over again.
We need Burnham all over again in action. We do have Burnham in terms of the ideas, in terms of the legacy it's left us. What we need is Burnham all over again in terms of that machinery, that leadership. And that's not the individual Burnham now. That's the systems, the structures, and the people who can take this country forward.
The institution. The last words on today's program from Mr. Vincent Alexander AA. We have been discussing Burnham, emancipation, and independence.
Let us understand emancipation did not mean Ghana became independent. Emancipation simply meant that the enslaved people were released into this economic arrangement where the market drives forces. And we know how that market, the labor market, was manipulated by the import of indentured people, etc., etc. So emancipation did not mean independence. It meant the individual was relieved of the status of a slave, but released into an exploitative system that the colonizers continued to manipulate in their interests. The struggle has to continue to take us beyond that state into a real state of independence locally and, I would say, interdependence internationally.
A topic for another discussion. Thank you very much, Mr. Alexander, for joining me and sharing your views and your knowledge with us. To our viewers, I thank you for joining us from wherever you have joined us today and staying with us the course of the program. Until we meet again next Sunday, God bless, stay safe.
As Guyana sits on the economic and political crossroads, we speak to the nation's opinion leaders and decision makers to get their views on the challenges the country faces and the path it must take to achieve national development. Welcome to Nation Watch. Now here is your host Mervyn Williams, former member of the Guyana Parliament.